Goedemiddag allemaal, welkom bij deze tweede internationale sessie op de Voor de Jeugddag met als thema netwerkpleegzorg. Ik ga dadelijk overschakelen in het Engels vanwege onze internationale spreekster uit Ierland, Dr. Valerie O'Brien. Maar voordat ik dat doe wil ik graag even iedereen die nu in deze sessie aanwezig is erop wijzen dat je de chat kan benutten om vragen te stellen. Een belangrijk punt is denk ik ook dat als je het wat lastig vindt om die vragen in het Engels te stellen, voel je welkom deze gewoon in het Nederlands neer te zetten en dan zullen wij ervoor zorgen dat de vraag in het Engels aan Dr. Valerie O'Brien wordt gesteld. Okay, then again, I want to welcome you, but this time in English, and especially welcome to our international guest, Dr. Valerie O'Brien. Today's session is going to be about kinship foster care, because we know that when a child can no longer live at home, this has a huge impact on its life. Therefore, professionals will often try to look if they can find someone within the network that can take care of the child and already know the child and vice versa. But like formal foster care, kinship care is not without challenges. And it influences the assessment procedures. So therefore, I have asked Dr. Valerie O'Brien, who has done international research on kinship care and especially assessment, to go through her experiences and knowledge and share them with us on the assessment procedures and on kinship care in generally, and more specifically on the IRIS model that she has developed. So therefore, having done this introduction, I would like to introduce Dr. Valerie O'Brien.
Good afternoon, everybody, even though it is still noon here in Dublin. But greetings to you from Dublin, and I really wish I was in Holland with you. We sure live in difficult and strange times, so I hope you are all remaining healthy in your country. So today I plan to discuss the challenges of assessment in relation to kinship care. I have a long background in assessment, and I've developed many different models in relation to the assessment of the foster home, the adoption home, and the kinship home here in Ireland. I worked first as a social worker in the 80s in this area, and I have worked at the university, but very much as a researcher practitioner since 1995. I have placed more slides on the presentation today than I will have time to consider in detail, but the reason I have asked you that I've placed them there is that I want you to have access to the material afterwards. Okay, so in the first 6 slides that we see in this presentation, I very much want you to ask yourself, from what position are you standing and listening to this presentation today? Because I know some of you may be practitioners, some may be managers, and some may have a more personal involvement in kinship care, whether you are a carer or whether you're a young person who has lived there. There's many details of the model that I developed here in Ireland that I share with you today that I will spend probably about 15 minutes at the end. But first, I would like you to ask yourself, in terms of the work that you're involved in relation to the assessment of the kinship home, who is asking you to do what and for whom? So I pay a lot of attention in my assessment model to helping people understand their own position. But first, there is very much a difference between formal and informal kinship care. In terms of the formal kinship home, I define that as a home where the state regulation and laws must apply and the full regulatory framework of the foster care system, while informal kinship care are those private foster arrangements. But we know from practice very often professionals are involved in encouraging families and networks to become involved in informal kinship care. So again, it is very important in terms of the assessment of the kinship home, where on the continuum from family support into child protection and into alternative care are you standing? But also, what is the mandate that you were given in your system? Okay, we do know in terms of children and carers in either formal or informal care, research would tell us that there are very little differences between the profile of children's needs and the carers' needs. So in this frame that I'm showing you now is to show you the rich diversity that happens on that continuum between formal and informal, and it is complex and ever-changing. So how do we hold the assessment brief when we're involved in such complexity? So the first point that I want to raise with you is that in terms of assessment, we must, regardless of what our responsibility in terms of the assessment, we must always see the relational field that we're working in relation to birth parents, the relatives that we tend to use in Ireland as the word rather than kin, children, and the agencies. So the fifth province in the middle is to enable you to help be really clear about your own position. But research will tell us, and this is really, really important, what is it that the different participants want from the kinship home? So the birth parents want to be respected and supported. The agencies really want to make sure that they support all and protect all, but most important for the child, that the child is in a safe and stable place. The children want love and understanding, and they just want to be let get on with their life. But also the parents want a place in the child's life to be loved and to love and to be accepted. So two key questions in terms of assessment: what elements are privileged and given priority by the agencies? And what are the processes that remain invisible in decision making? Because we all know those processes happen. So very quickly, I want to just draw your attention, but we don't have time here today, to look at what the research tells us about what are the benefits for children in formal kin care. And this is important in terms of the assessment of the kinship home, because we must really carry what we know from research, but also research is very partial in terms of our assessment practices. So the orange here refers to what's more favourable compared to non-kin care, but protection and safety and behaviour and development, there's more ambiguous research findings. And equally in terms of the challenges in the kinship home, and here highlighted in yellow, how to account for the differences in the assessment of the kinship home, because what we know is that the kin carers come to foster care, kin care, in a very different way than your stranger foster carers. But we know that there are many, many challenges at the heart of kinship care. The needs of carers are enormous, less support, finance, and this is very political and at the heart of social justice issues, is that who pays and who cares. So in this frame, I want to introduce you to the intersectionality. And again, this is to enable you to focus on the assessment brief that you may have. But in any kinship care, foster care system, I would contend in any system, we must always pay attention to the four parameters of law, policy, values, and resources. But what is important in this frame are the orientating questions to give you clarity about what is the brief or mandate that you're being asked to do in relation to the kin home. So the law, what must I do? What should I do? Really important values, what do I want to do? And then what can I do? So again, moving on to assessment. Assessment can never be viewed as an end in itself, even though we may have to begin it, write a report and present it to a committee. It is not an exact science. We need to use other decision-making and accounting process in the system once the kin home is assessed. And there, if the child is in formal kinship care, we have whole review process. But I would say, last but not least, as a worker, we need honesty, clarity, and to be able to work with ambivalence. The key assessment issue, particularly for the placement, is for the placement agency, but also for the kin network. How do we know that we have the best kin care home? And how do we know it will be a safe placement for the child? And how do we answer these questions when we have a very tight time frame within which to make a decision? How do the different pathways to the placement, because the vast majority of kin care become involved because of a crisis. My research shows that 1/3 of the children were already in the kin home, and due to the deterioration of the relationships, there was a need for child welfare agencies to get involved. 1/3 were in the care system already, and due to a placement disruption in their foster home, they were moved to kin, and 1/3 came straight in from child protection systems. Hunt draws very important attention in her work, where she says professionals have lots of hunches in their practice, but there's a lack of evidence base in the decision making. So already I have talked here about the difference between kin and non-care, and the vast majority of kin carers never plan to take on the care of their kin member, except it was an emergency. But also the kin, what motivates kin to get involved is somewhere on the continuum between the emotional connection they have with the child or a sense of family obligation. And depending on where they are, it really depends and will shape a lot of the assessment, but also the decision making. Again, I have highlighted again this conceptual framework just to draw your attention to the highlight or to the importance of the questions. So here I want to draw attention very quickly. Oh, it's gone, and this is what happens when we move too fast. I want to draw attention to what are the capacities that we're looking for in the kin placement. So here, the safety issues, how do we know that we have the best option? I've already highlighted, but we're looking for kin family members who can deal with the complexity of family dynamics, but also that the family and agency relationships are complicated. Family member will always be a member of the family, but the agency will always be outside that family network. We're looking for people that have insight to self, that can understand the job, even though it's a complex job in terms of that they remain a family member, but they now become a formal foster carer, and that they can support and will let the agency support them. What I want, just again very quickly, to draw attention to what do the kin want in terms of kinship care, is that we know they need help with the family dynamics, they need support, they need help to navigate the extended family network, they need advice, particularly legal advice, and information as to how the systems work. We think as professionals, because we've explained it once, that therefore we have told people. So how good are the information and leaflets, for example, you have in your system? So what assessment needs? We first and foremost, we need the care plan to be as clear as possible. We need to understand the complex network of relationships. We need to be able to open up positions in a context of trust. And we need to see the family as a resource, because my premise is that the vast majority of families will make safe plans for children if they're given adequate information. So the assessment is always a process of identifying supports, identifying needs, identifying vulnerabilities and strengths. So it's a complex act, but let's keep our attention here for a moment. We have to keep the needs of the child in the center, but also we must look at the needs of the relatives and the parents. And we know in child welfare agencies, very often professionals stop looking at the needs of parents once there's a plan for a long-term home. We talk a lot about it, but we don't act. But in my model, I very much in looking at risks, strengths and vulnerabilities, demarcate between support needs and supervision needs. So moving to the next, what looks like a complex table, but the important issue here is to distinguish between high and low support needs. And on the x-axis, we have a distinction between low and high supervision needs. So for example, in the top right-hand corner up here, we have placements where there's a high need for support, but also the agency is unsure about the safety issues. So safety remains a concern. Equally, in terms of high supervision, we may be involved in situations where the relatives are saying, we need low levels of support, but the agency is left with a dilemma because they are unsure again about the protection needs. And they're wondering if the family network are pushing away the support because they don't want intrusion from outsiders. On the other hand, where we have low supervision and the agency is satisfied that the safety of the child is being attended to, we have kin homes that may have very high support needs, but we also have some kin that have low support needs. And in my model, I always pay attention, can kin foster care be diverted to less intrusive services to enable the child to have as normal an experience as possible, while the kin are provided with the necessary financial and other supports. So I will return to this very important conceptual frame later, but it is key to assessment. I also want to draw attention that there is a difference in the assessment stage where the indication is that there's a need for an emergency or a short-term placement, as opposed to where the indication is that the child may need a longer-term or more permanent care planning. In the first instance, we usually have very little time and we're looking at needs, the parenting and family aspects, the safety and the family environment. Whereas in the longer term ones, I would say what's really key in the extended family assessment is the triadic relationship between the birth parents and the relatives, and the extent to which the relatives are able to navigate those loyalty conflicts and to ensure that the child will have a mechanism to deal with what will be ongoing conflict, but that they have an ability not to triangulate the child further. Here again, we have a very complex frame, but I want to draw your attention here that on the outside we have the safety and the component issues that I've already discussed. In red, we have the 4 domains of values, policy, resources, and legislation. But I would contend that in analysis, or what we need for the assessment of the kinship home, we need practitioners that can make good analysis, that that have knowledge about the systems and are able to work with complexity, have a really, really good ability to build relationships and to have an understanding and be very self-reflexive. And this is achieved if those skills are in place, but also a readiness to work with cooperation and with good communication with the kin family. And that it is achieved through a lot of hard work. But again, assessment is not an end in itself. And the model that I developed in Ireland pointed to the importance of having 2 workers from the outset working conjointly together. In many systems, we have 2 workers. We have one who's designated as the child's worker and the other for the family placement worker. In my model, these 2 workers need to work together for the duration of the assessment, which is between 12 and 16 weeks. And the important feature is one manager needs to be involved in overseeing the work of both workers to ensure that there's not an escalation in between 2 managers and 2 different workers. And that there's both assessment and intervention happening simultaneously. The tools that have been developed as part of the assessment model, first is the template for the final report. There's a stage and task framework where there's key clinical and supervision questions. And there's also, I pulled together what are some tried and tested methods in assessment, for example, the use of the genogram, ecomap, sociogram. But key to this model is the family network meeting, because my premise is that the family network meeting is central. If we give them family network meeting or family group conference, it's defined differently in different countries. It's on the basis, if we give the family enough information, they will ensure that the best kinship family will be helped to come forward, but also safety will be a shared responsibility. Again, we have the support and supervision template, but also we have another tool that we use here in Ireland based on my research, is that there's a typology of different networks of relationships in the kinship home. So for example, some kinship, it's like quasi-adoption. The birth parents are out of the picture, unfortunately, due to long-term difficulties. There's some where the birth parents are, again, quite marginalized. There's other placements where we have the optimum to what I would call a shared care, and there's others that are very conflictual and that oscillate, and that those placements are usually unstable and at risk of breaking down. So here again, we have the support and supervision, and I would say that the key questions for the support and supervision template: what is the profile of the children and carers involved in terms of their needs, vulnerabilities, and strengths? What do we know about the support provision available? And very often professionals will only identify the supports that's available and not what's needed. What is the level of supervision required, and what's the evidence for this? And what service model do you have, and do you have to adapt? Now, here I would say that the backbone to the Irish model was that the child needs a placement, and there's usually a very tight time frame within which it's 12 and 16 weeks here in Ireland, and I understand it. There's a similar time frame in Holland. But in the next frame, we see that the different tasks of the two workers is outlined. So we have the child's worker, the care plan. What is the care plan? The intervention around contact. There's ongoing need for supporting the child, intervention, and the assessment is going on. So the family placement worker in the old system would only assess the kinship home, whereas in this model, the family placement worker and the child and family worker have to be both involved in a range of tasks and have coordination and consultation through the one manager who has an overview of everything that's going on. I don't have time to go into this, but this is really outlined in full in a 2013 article. I also want to draw attention here to what's known about counterindications in relation to the kinship home. That's very important for assessment. Also, where there's a history of abuse and where there's an inability to provide secondary protection. And we know against all hope that sometimes family members can talk the talk, but they cannot follow through. We also need to be very careful where there's very high levels of conflict between the kin home and the birth parents, and where there's an indication where there's limited capacity around resolution or insight in terms of the kin carer's ability to resolve it. Where there's very high tensions and they perpetuate torn loyalties for the child, that's likely to be sustained over a lifetime. Where there's a scapegoating for the child or lack of understanding, or where on the one hand I'm saying we have to work with ambivalence, but that ambivalence really gets played out in terms of scapegoating of the child. Or where motivation is problematic. For example, I've worked with kin where they said, well, my mother before she died made me promise that I would take care of the children, but guess what? I am just at the end of it, but I can't let my mother down. where there's disagreements about the care plan. So fundamentally, where the relatives think that the child should be with the birth parents and not in the care system. Where discipline, and regardless, where there's such different and high differences in methods of discipline, and that they are unable to understand why the agency does not permit corporal punishment or different modes of discipline. And I'm sure you have many others. Now, the implementation stages of the assessment model in Ireland was extraordinarily problematic, and I want to share those very briefly. What was problematic was that the organizations in which I was trying to implement were so rigid in what I would call the two silos of working with the child and the family and working with the family with the kin home, and there was not enough coordination or ability to change, because silos take a long time to develop in systems, and it is very hard to change systems. And that was the single biggest adaptation. So if we are really serious about assessing the kinship home and working with the challenges, we as professionals need to be able to change. I think the other issues here in terms of trying to find a way forward, the key messages I want to leave you with is that assessment can be done differently, provided we are very clear about the support and supervision needs. It can be done in a short period, provided we use the other decision-making process in the system. It is not an end in itself, and we have to say risk is part of the life we live in. We identify and we're honest about vulnerabilities, and we ask the extended family about what they see as some of the solutions to the vulnerabilities and what supports they need. And central to it is an open and honest relationship where we can build real trust. And real trust means that professionals sometimes have to say, we don't have the answers. We do not know. But together, if we work well together, if we put the child at the center, we can make the best decisions possible at this point in time. And as long as we are here for one another and to really listen to one another, we can find a way forward. So I would say central is the capacity to build honest relationships. And that comes back to us, the professional responsibility to know ourselves, to pay attention to our own biographical accounts. What are our values? What are our blind spots? What are our prejudices? And what are our certainties? And if we can start in that point, we have a really good chance of finding a way forward to assessing the kinship home with all the complexities. So thank you. I know I have went very fast through a lot of information, but I'm really interested in hearing what you might have to say, your thoughts, your questions.
Yes. Well, Valerie, thank you very much. And like you said, there's a lot to be said about kinship care in itself, and also the assessment procedures and what is needed and the different roles involved, the dynamics. And it's a challenge to put that all in this time frame that we have this afternoon. But what I think is also interesting, and I'm checking also, of course, the questions we get in, is that can you tell us more about what was the reason that in Ireland the call for developing this kinship care assessment model?
Okay, so I would have worked, I did my PhD back in the 90s in relation to the kinship home. And in fact, out of that, it was one of the first studies done in kinship care in Ireland. It was very clear that the assessment model at that stage, which was a biographical imposed, it was what I would call a square peg in a round hole. And it was not working. But I also want to tell you that the model that I developed has been used in some agencies, but not all, because of the resistance to change, I would say, principally among the professionals who, in fact, have a position in the system. So it's not that they don't like the ideas, but the ability to have the necessary adaptability where two workers work together for that 12 to 16 weeks has not always been forthcoming.
Yeah. So I understand it's also a challenge, not only to have developed this framework, but also to have the implementation within Ireland, which was not a given. That's very clear.
No.
We actually have someone.
Just one other point from this, because I was also involved in developing a standardized framework for intercountry adoption. My work, I'm a systemic practitioner. I work from a family system systemic practitioner. So I'm always interested in that interface between practitioners, families, and systems. So what I have to say about assessment is not just about kinship home, but it is also about assessment practices in relation to alternative care.
We will have a very interesting question also relating to what you just pointed out. But before going to that, we have a caller, Harmke, and she would like to ask a question. Hello, are you there, Harmke?
Hello.
Hi, Harmke.
Yeah.
I'm Harmke, but my question, you did answer already.
Oh, and what was your question? I'm curious.
The reason for developing a kinship care assessment model in Ireland. So you told us. Thank you very much.
Okay. But the other point I would add to that is kinship care emerged not necessarily as a thought-out philosophical position. I would say that kinship care in Ireland in the 90s emerged because of the shortage of foster carers in the system and the system problems. So it was less a philosophical. Now it is philosophical that we should look at the kinship home first. But a lot of the time professionals talk the talk, and I am a professional, but we don't always follow up with the action. Why else are we not using more family group conferencing?
I see. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Harmke. Okay, Valerie,
All right.
I have another interesting question. And it's asking what happens in Ireland when the assessment shows that the kin family is not suitable, but the child is already living with these people. And are you working with families to make them fit, or do you take the child away? Which way does it go?
So the question that I'm trying to answer is what happens because the vast majority of kin care, the assessments happen where the child is in situ. I would say that that provides a really real-time basis on which to assess the needs and the protection issues of the child. Mm-hmm. If this is where your support supervision template is really important, because if what the evidence is that the supervision needs of the child are the supervision needs as identified by the agency are very high, and I would use a ranking question from 0 to 5. So where on a 0 to 5, where 5 is the highest and 0 is low, are the supervision needs. And then you would look at the support axis. To what extent, again, are the family willing to accept the issues that the agency is highlighting, and their willingness to accept the supports to deal with the supervision issues. So of all the templates I have provided to you, I think that template is very useful.
The support division template
that
you mentioned.
So
yes.
The support supervision, yes. Yep. And using ranking questions from 0 to 5.
Yep.
Because if you're at a 5, then you should be taking measures and getting the child out of there if there's low level of acceptance of supervision, of support from the relatives.
I think we're live again. I was kind of afraid that we lost you, Valerie, but Good news, you're back. I am back, so welcome again, everyone. You just fell away in the question with regard, like, what happens if the foster care, kinship care carers are not seen as suitable by the professionals. And you said then the support's sufficient, and you have provided different templates that can be very useful in those kind of situations. And since we have not so much time left anymore, I have this question that, is there a difference in the percentage of breakdowns between kinship care and non-kinship care? Do you know that? Do you have information about that from your own research?
What I would say that there's not enough research. There's not enough because there's very few comparative studies. I think we can look at that more in terms of looking at the research of the benefits of relative care. And what we know are that relatives tend to deal better with the challenges of children's behaviour than non-kin. Now, and that's an important factor in relation to breakdown issues. As we know, in foster care, it is very often identified as the child's behaviour that leads to the breakdown. Why are family members more tolerant? Sometimes they're more tolerant because they can understand the child, they have a different emotional connection with the child, or in fact, they're quite prepared they will keep the child regardless. It's connected with motivation. But we need more research. It also depends on the pathways. We need finer research in terms of the ages of the children going into the kinship home, because we know a lot of teenagers end up going into kinship care, and that can be a very problematic age. Yeah. So
so from research, it's inconclusive. We cannot tell whether kinship care or non-kinship care. I mean, it depends. Of course, every situation is different, and depends also on the child and the problems and behavior problems and issues it has to deal with, including the parents and the kinship carers. Yeah. Given that we almost are at the end of our session, I think a very interesting and last question I would like to ask you, because you shared with us that the implementation was not without challenge in Ireland, because people find it difficult sometimes also to work with new standards and new procedures. But still, we are very interested to know in what way the implementation of the Irish kinship model that you created has led to better outcomes for children in kinship care.
Okay, first I have to stress that it has not been implemented across the country. Mm-hmm. It was implemented in some agencies, so I don't have outcome measures per se, but I would say that the most important outcome is that you can identify what the risks, the vulnerabilities, the strengths, and find a way through good working relationships to work with the issues. Because we know in standard assessment practices, the relationships can break down between the kin carer and the agency because of mistrust. Mm-hmm. And very often kin do not ask for what they need because they're afraid that that will be interpreted by the agency as them not managing. In our model, because support and supervision is at the core of it, it's about being honest about what are the vulnerabilities, what are the risks, what are the supports, and what are the strengths. But it's also about using the other decision-making process in an open day. It's not to say that kinship care is problem-free because of this assessment model, but it gets you through. My model gets the job done, which is to reach a decision to say, yes, this child is going to be in this home. And then we use review processes, statutory review processes of the care plan.
Valerie,
to continue to
we have one last actually live question, and I think it's again Harmke. So Harmke, welcome again. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, loud and clear.
You asked my question already, so...
my God, I can read your mind, right?
Already, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you again, Harmke. Okay, so we're gonna end this session. What I understand very clearly, and actually we had it in the previous international session as well, key is relationships. Because there's so many dynamics involved with the child, with its biological parents, with the kinship carers, and to understand as a professional their different needs and wishes and how to support them in a way that you can create this situation where the child is not only safe, but is also put in a best placement, a best home for during the time that's staying with the kinship carers. So thank you for that message of relationships.
There is one thing I would add to relationships.
Yes.
There is just one thing. I would say key to relationship is the professionals' availability to ask themselves what are their values, how do their values of family, their perception of family influence their assessment of the families they're working with. It is really central because people carry a lot of biases. And there's also cross-cultural issues of not understanding the difference between families that are, some families are, the Western families are I families. It's all about me, the individual. And other cultures, it's about we. And it's about understanding that cultural nuance.
Yeah. So thank you for this addition.
We could be here all day. And I would
of
love to hear other people's views of what are the challenges in Holland. But alas, technology is limited.
Yeah, for today, it's this what we can share, and I hope we can do some more and have some more information from you, and share your knowledge in a different way. But I want to thank you for sharing your findings and insights about the Irish situation, and I also want to thank the public for their questions. And as was mentioned in the chat, the presentation was a lot of information, so you will be able to find it on the website of For de Jeugddag. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Ciao, ciao. See
Bye.
you.